it is. So in Canada, all Indigenous peoples make up a little bit less than 5% of the population. So keep that number in mind, 5%. But Indigenous peoples represent 30% of those people that are incarcerated in federal prisons. Indigenous women, 42%. I mean, it's absolutely incredible. And Indigenous youth, well over 50%. But you can't just look at it on a national basis. That alone's a crisis. But in provinces like Saskatchewan, the rate of Indigenous girls are 98% in youth corrections. I mean, it's almost 100%. Boys, it's 92%. In provinces like Manitoba, the Indigenous incarceration rate is 80%. I mean, it's unfounded. And no surprise to most people that 2/3 of Native people in prisons came from the foster care system, and a fifth came from the residential school system. You've got police killings, which are, that's in the news right now. And, people are trying to debate whether or not it's just a few bad apples in policing or whether we have a widespread problem. Well, let me tell you, the statistics bear out the widespread problem. We're only 5% of the population, but nationally, we represent 15% of all those killed by police officers. In Manitoba, we're about 16% of the population, but 58% of all police killings. In Saskatchewan, it's similar, 15% of the population, but 63% of the killings. And one of the most dangerous police forces on the planet, besides the RCMP, is the Winnipeg Police Service. Because in Winnipeg, the current population rate is only 10%, but they represent the highest. 64% of all police killings are Indigenous peoples. It should be no surprise that when you look at the statistics for murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, even the RCMP's own report prior to the national inquiry found that while Indigenous women and girls are only 2% of the population, about 2.5% of the population. Nationally, we're 16% of those that go murdered and missing, but the homicide rate is 7 times that at a time when homicide rates and crime rates are going down in this country, not for Indigenous women and girls. But in Manitoba and Saskatchewan, murders and disappearances of Indigenous women and girls are well over 50%. We're the number one target of human traffickers and serial killers, and we're less likely to be murdered by our spouses than Canadian women, and more likely to be murdered by an acquaintance or a stranger. And that says something, because oftentimes the media tries to portray that as, oh, that's all your problem. No, it's not. There's a real infection of racism and violence in this country. Nationally, foster care, 50% of all kids in care are Indigenous. In Manitoba, it's 90%. In Saskatchewan, it's 85%. And all of these rates are rising, by the way. So there's this myth in society that our socioeconomic conditions are getting better. They're not. They're getting worse, especially the incarceration rates. The sad thing about First Nations kids in foster care is statistically, they're less likely to get an education, more likely to be exploited, abused, and trafficked, more likely to end up killed by police, in youth corrections, in prisons. I mean, we have literally set up a minefield for people in the foster care system, and they're 4 times more likely to be sexually assaulted in foster care than in their own care. And, I know I'm at my 15-minute mark, but I thought those statistics were equally as important as understanding the water crisis in First Nations, that there's more than 100 First Nations without clean water, and some haven't had it for 10 years, that more than 28% of First Nations live in overcrowded housing, half of them in need of major repair, and half of those that should be legally condemned, that we live 15 years less than everyone else, that there's now a 35-year education gap, there's thousands on the post-secondary education waiting list, there's a 63-year gap in income, the suicide crisis. I mean, 38% of all youth deaths are from suicide, and that's nationally, 10 times higher than Canadians. And the poverty crisis, 60% of First Nation kids live in poverty. But in Manitoba, that number jumps to 76%. And, you know, we can't forget about the cultural crisis, where 96% of all Indigenous languages are at high risk of extinction. There's only 3 that are safe from immediate extinction. So these statistics say something. A, they're not our fault. B, they're a crisis. I mean, it's Canada's biggest crisis. And C, there is a legal and moral obligation for everyone to do something about it, because although the majority of the fault falls on governments for having created this system, society benefits from these ongoing conditions. And we need to do better, because we're talking about the strongest people on this planet who have survived genocide, but we've taken a big hit. This intergenerational trauma has taken a big hit. And thank goodness you're going to hear from Michael, who's going to say all of the great things that we're doing to try to combat all of these negative conditions in our communities.